in Tucson.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the speaker series, which is jointly hosted by the Digital Civil Society Lab and the team behind the Public Interest Technology class. My name is Toussaint Notias and I'm the Associate Director of Research at the Digital Civil Society Lab. So I'm really delighted tonight to be welcoming Todd Davies. Todd Davies is the Associate Director and a lecturer in the Symbolic Systems program and a researcher at the Center for the Study of Language and Information at Stanford University. He holds a PhD in cognitive psychology, an MS in data analysis and statistical computing, and a BS in statistics, all from Stanford. So you've seen the place, all well, and I'm sure it's informing your work so importantly. His research focuses on group deliberation, technology, and methods for social decision making and information policy. Tonight we have the real pleasure of welcoming Todd to talk about the work that he's been working on, emerging from a recent article on the idea of creating a corporation for public software, modeled after the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And I think in these times of increased dependencies on digital infrastructure, this is an idea needed more than ever. And I'm so happy that we're getting to explore it tonight. So I'll hand it over to Todd, and I'll just say before that if you have any clarifying questions during the talk, you can put them in the chat box, and other more substantial questions too. We'll try to get more likely to the substantial question after the talk, but we'll try to bring in the contextual clarifying questions as we go through. And we'll have about 30 minutes from the talk and then the rest for Q&A. So Todd, welcome, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak. The title of the talk is "What is Needed to Build and Sustain Public Software for Government and Civil Society?" And it's based on this paper that I wrote, co-wrote with John Gastil. John was the first author, which published at the beginning of this year in the new journal called Digital Government Research and Practice. It's an ACM journal. And the paper is a proposal for creating what we call a corporation for public software, loosely modeled on the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in the US. So I'm not going to go through all the points in the paper. I'm going to talk about some of them and then try to deepen the analysis in one area, asking about different alternative ways to fund public software, and also considering the way that the deliberation, which is the main thing that I've been studying for the last 20 years, happens online now, and why the largest platforms for that don't seem to be quite adequate for it. I first want to begin with a brief personal history of online deliberation, based on how I got involved in this area about 20 years ago, and use that as a jumping off point to talk generally about what's happened with attempts to build deliberative capabilities into online environments and to use online environments and social media for deliberative purposes. And I should say, my definition of deliberation is that it is thinking and discussion that is purposive, that's aimed at some decision or action. And so it's not just any discussion or conversation, but it's built around, it happens around some decision to be made or action to be taken. So the first paper that I wrote in this space was with a group of students in the early 2000s. It was originally presented at the American Political Science Association meeting in 2002. This was called Community Democracy Online, a preliminary report from East Palo Alto. And it reported on work that we did under the aegis of what we called the Partnership for Internet Equity and Community Engagement, which was a partnership between our team at Stanford, funded by the Haas Center for Public Service, and a couple of nonprofit organizations in East Palo Alto, which were the East Palo Alto Community Network, trying to provide computer access to residents in East Palo Alto at that time, and the One East Palo Alto Neighborhood Improvement Initiative, which was a funded community improvement initiative by the Hewlett Foundation that was based on community-based planning. So the way that we got interested in this, or in the topic that I'll talk about, is by observing this process of community-based planning in East Palo Alto about how to spend the large grant that had been given by the Hewlett Foundation to this coordinating nonprofit called One East Palo Alto, which still exists. And the way that decisions were made was largely in community meetings where different priorities were assessed, and members of the community were able to weigh in on what they thought were the best ways of spending it, the biggest priorities for the community, what would get the best impact for the money that was being spent. And so we attended lots of these meetings, we did surveys, we interviewed residents, and this paper was an outgrowth of that study. And some key findings from it reported in that paper were that the ability of residents to participate in those meetings was hampered by the requirement that they attend face-to-face meetings. Many people in East Palo Alto could not go to meetings because they had work conflicts or other conflicts, or just couldn't make it physically. And that meant that there were key voices missing, especially when there were, most impactfully, when there were open decision-making meetings that conflicted with other meetings, like an event that focused on housing for some residents. So those and other constraints on participation undermined the perceived legitimacy of the initiative in the community. That was one of our findings, and we thought that it altered its priorities as a result. We also observed that in these face-to-face meetings, it was difficult to make decisions in a timely way because the time was limited and the issues were complex. And there were other problems that are common to face-to-face meetings involving communication between meetings, being able to remember and keep track of what's been decided when the participants change from meeting to meeting, communication between subgroups, making information available during and between meetings, and issues that were related to decision procedures and transparency. So common problems of group democracy. We decided that an interesting project to undertake as a result of that study, which we hope to share with East Palo Alto, but which never really got transferred, was a platform which continues to be worked on, developed, and evolved over the years, called Deem, D-E-M-E. So there are papers online that describe where the names comes from, but it was designed originally as a platform for online deliberation. And some of the design principles were that we wanted it to support the overall work of groups. East Palo Alto in particular had lots of nonprofit and other community groups that faced this problem of having to overcome the limitations of face-to-face meetings. We wanted it to be relatively comprehensive in what it could support all of the usual deliberative tasks associated with face-to-face meetings. We wanted it to maximize the number of desired participants in the group's deliberation and minimize barriers to their participation. And we wanted it to facilitate a subjective quality of interaction and decision-making that met or exceeded what the group could achieve in face-to-face meetings. So those last two criteria in particular, the participation and quality criteria, are common for discussion in deliberation. How good, how much quality is there in the deliberation as a measure of whether it's taking place, and how many people are participating, and also are they participating equally and fairly. Principles that are loosely associated with philosopher Jürgen Habermas. There have been, I think, in the wider experience with deliberation online, some experiential findings over the years since then, since the early 2000s. I think early on we found that people had limited time and attention, and that's still the case, and that online deliberation as one application of the internet or online environments competes with many other demands that people have on their minds, and that digital technology places on them. We also realized through experience and research the importance of salience, that in particular online tools will not be used if they don't fit into people's lives naturally. And so this is, I think Ethan Zuckerman talks about this as the cute cats phenomenon, that a platform that makes it easy for people to share pictures of cute cats or the things that people are really interested in is more likely to draw their attention and be used for other purposes like deliberation than a tool that is specifically designed for deliberation. We found that people needed notifications in order to get their attention drawn to things, and that's been an ongoing problem when deliberation happens over some time beyond one meeting. We also found, I mean, I think this, not just us, but in general, the field has found that deliberation on its own is just not motivating for most people. And as a result, many of the sites and tools that people developed using the technology to facilitate deliberation became ghost towns, were just not used or couldn't attract enough users. Whereas, as I alluded to earlier, social media that were designed for other purposes, like meeting people, think Facebook, or sharing videos of cats, think YouTube, were actually more successful at generating deliberation than sites that were specifically designed for it. So that's one of the main experiential findings. I think we can note some achievements and failures of social media and deliberation online in general. One is that small group deliberation using general tools, even email, video conferencing, now Zoom, does work in many cases. So that's definitely a success story, especially the smaller the group gets. We can also say, I think, that social media have helped people find each other and to be exposed to different ideas, at least sometimes. Early on in this field, there was a lot of worry that the internet would just be an echo chamber and people would only gravitate toward content that already matched their beliefs and attitudes. I think the research has shown that that's not quite the case, although it can sometimes be a phenomenon. We've also found, though, on the more negative side, that deliberation is very difficult to achieve at scale when you get beyond small groups. That democratic culture seems at this moment in time to be in decline in societies that have a lot of internet access rather than rising. And that's kind of seems like a paradox in relation to the early hopes that were placed on technology. And I think at this moment, that at least there's a lot of literature that suggests commercial social media platforms, for example, Facebook and Twitter, have been somewhat undermining to democracy, at least in some cases, that they seem to promote demagoguery and xenophobia, despite their earlier roles earlier in the last decade in facilitating social movements like the Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter, and even the Me Too movement just a few years ago and today. So the paper that I mentioned at the beginning has more references on all of that. So I'd encourage you to go there if you want to find books and articles that try to make that case about the failure of social media platforms, large commercial platforms, for achieving democratic outcomes. What I want to think about now is a little more theoretically about if we take that as given for the moment, why would it be that the main commercial platforms are deficient in achieving democratic outcomes? So I want to think through the logic of how those platforms are funded and designed and the consequences of that for democracy. Well, I think the first things to note are that commercial social media, which I'm going to call CSM platforms, they're not designed for democracy. That's not their primary purpose. If we think about the main ones, they were all designed for something else. So in a sense, it's unfair to ask them to be the main platforms for democracy, since that wasn't the main purpose for which they were designed. What they were designed for instead was, what they have come to be designed for is obtaining attention-based revenue, generally in the form of advertising. I think that famous phrase from Mark Zuckerberg speaking before a congressional committee, Senator, we place ads. That's the way that Facebook makes its money. It's the way that commercial social media in general make their money, through what the lawyer Tim Wu calls the attention economy. So some consequences of that, of being designed for attention rather than for deliberation, are that commercial social media favor attention rather than deliberation, not surprisingly. So we get phenomena like lots of clickbait that appears in the feeds of a user in social media. Rewards to the brain, the dopamine system, like likes. There's lots of research showing that getting likes and other rewards from social media stimulates the brain, in some cases in ways like addictive drugs do. Content that is self-referring rather than that refers to the public or collectives or to is other directed. Promotion of fear and anger over other types of emotions. So it's not saying that these are the only things that appear in social media. Obviously that's not true, but that commercial platforms, because of the way they're designed and the purposes for which they're designed, tend to favor these types of content. And the argument is that that's bad for democracy. Commercial social media, I would argue, also favor the interests of advertisers over users. So as a result, we get the design of the platform as the user sees it, the interface is suited to paid promotion, since that's the business of the platform, is to promote things that are paid for. We also get phenomena like surreptitious data collection and retention, which results in violations of privacy or collection of data that users may not be aware of or may not want to be collected. The use of predictive algorithms and micro-targeting in ways that can be manipulative, including in electoral politics, famously in 2016. Censorship that takes place that's in the interests of advertisers. So these are kind of predictions that would come from a model of social media as being commercially driven, as being attention driven. This is one of the consequences that you would predict. I would argue also that it comes out of this model. It is predicted that commercial social media would favor corporate over user control or democratic control and over user freedoms. So we get things like forced logins, the inability to see much content without logging into the platform and therefore telling the company who you are and being able to assist its advertisers with tracking. Profits that go to the company and its investors. That's an obvious consequence of a corporate platform. A monopoly interest, an interest in keeping users within the platform as opposed to kind of equally sharing access outside of the platform, or being a place that's easy to jump off to other places or to share your data with. Control of the content by the company itself, for example, in content moderation. Those decisions in commercial platforms are made by a hierarchy within the company, and they may take user interests into account, but users don't have control over it. And also non-customizable or minimally customizable terms of service that serve the interest of the company, and they're very difficult for the users to reject if they want to use the platform. And the users can't reject the terms of service. And finally, I'd say that commercial social media favor deep over shallow pocketed advertisers, which means that they favor wealthier over poorer people. And that means that the message that you're going to be seeing will be biased toward the interests of wealthier people over poorer people. They favor larger corporations over smaller ones if the larger ones have deeper pockets. They favor governments over citizens and social movements, because governments have become more able, now that they're savvy about it, to purchase ads and to hire social media platforms as their assistants, essentially, in getting their message out. And it favors political clients of the company or the platform over those clients' opponents. So famously in 2016, there was a Facebook team that worked closely with the Trump campaign because they were paid to do so. So these are all kind of general statements of some of the reasons why a commercial social media platform might not be democratic. There have been a number of alternatives proposed, and I want to talk about the main ones that have been proposed, and then suggest another one that is explored in the paper with Gastil that I mentioned at the beginning. So here are what I take to be the main ways that people have proposed to create better online deliberation. And this is going back even before the current social media platforms were around, going back to the late 90s or early 2000s, and maybe earlier. So one approach is to build platforms that are geared toward democracy or democratic applications within government itself, for the government to produce those platforms to make it part of its work. And I'm not going to, in a minute, I'm going to talk about some of the consequences of those, but right now I just want to kind of list these approaches. So that's one approach, is to do it within government. There's an argument for doing that. If it's about democracy and that's government's work, then maybe it should be the government that provides the tool for that particular application. Another big approach, especially in the US, I think, has been nonprofit platforms, which have been created either as proprietary or as non-proprietary software, but which are not commercially driven, not profit-making, but are nonprofit organizations, or platforms that are used by nonprofit organizations and foundations. And there's too much of the details of this to get into, so I'm just really speaking schematically here. There's also the approach, it's been popular in many circles since the late 90s, of creating open source software or free software with so-called copyleft license, which makes the source code available for importation and modification, and makes it more transparent. And for a long time, there's been an argument that if you have open source software, and if it also requires that you share back modifications, that it both takes advantage of the capabilities of digital technology for this type of sharing, and makes it more transparent, and that type of software is more suited toward democratic applications. Another approach, I would say, especially in the last few years, that many people have advocated is regulating commercial platforms. And some of this has happened already, especially outside of the US, but some within the US. So examples of proposals that have been made recently about social media platforms in the US are not allowing political ads on them. And some platforms have chosen to take that route voluntarily. Laws that would require more transparency in things like micro-targeting and so on. So various regulatory approaches to try to mitigate some of the biases that I mentioned earlier. And finally, antitrust enforcement. So Tim Wu, who I mentioned earlier, law professor at Columbia, has advocated in particular the breakup of a couple of the largest social media companies on grounds that there were acquisitions they made that shouldn't have been allowed under antitrust law. So I just want to mention that for each of these, what I see as the limitations of these approaches and the reasons why we've, John and I have made a different proposal from all of these. For government-built platforms, I think the issue is, there are a few issues. One is that there tends to be administrative protectiveness in government, because government officials, bureaucrats, and even elected officials are often not incentivized or motivated to give the public as much control as more democracy might require. There also tends to be just empirically a certain lack of dynamism and lack of exciting design in government-built platforms that makes it harder for people to use them, or makes people more reluctant to use them. I think government-built platforms have been more successful in some countries outside of the US, particularly in continental Europe. So that is one approach and some limitations. For nonprofit platforms, I think the problem there, as with nonprofit organizations in general, is it's difficult to achieve coordination across the many different nonprofit organizations that exist and the different platforms that they've put forward. So there's been a great number of platforms that have been created by nonprofits since the internet began, really. These are two of the problems that I've seen with that. For free and open source software, I think problems there have been revolved around lack of funding. Because the software is free to share and download and use, the lack of proprietary control is sometimes a challenge for funding. And empirically, there's also been an issue of the end user experience with open source software often being deficient. There are various reasons that have been suggested for that. Open source software, free software, often relies on the enthusiasm of programmers contributing back software that they themselves like using or like writing. So that means they're a different population from most of the end users. They're more savvy, they're more able to use software, and often less able to empathize with end users, and also perhaps less motivated to spend lots of time on kind of last mile issues that come up a lot when you're creating user interfaces for lots of different platforms that are out there. The regulation approach has its own issues, and so I would cite for that the phenomenon of regulatory capture that regulation in general has problems with. That the businesses, the industries that are regulated can sometimes often wind up controlling that process in government through the way that government and elections are funded. And regulation by its nature tends to leave structures in place and just places limits on them rather than creating new structures that are geared toward specific ends. Finally, antitrust enforcement. I think is just very difficult to win. Empirically, I think that's been the case, and it also has limited goals. If we think about the example that Tim Wu has suggested, that, for example, Facebook should be, according to him, broken up so that Instagram, which was bought by Facebook in the early part of last decade, should be spun off, maybe WhatsApp. That would just leave us with a few more very large companies, none of which are really designed for deliberation. So for our purposes, these solutions, we think, maybe don't really capture what we're looking for. The proposal that we put forward in the paper is for a corporation for public software, which would be a funding agency modeled on the US Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which provides some of the funding for the public broadcasting service, the National Public Radio, local public radio stations and TV stations, and lots of public broadcasting content. It would be, in our model, funded by the Congress, as the CPB is. It would have a governing board which is responsive to democratic change, but with built-in balance. That's the case for the CPB, and it's, as a result, proven fairly robust over time. It would be, as a result of the similarity to the CPB, leveraged with other funding sources in our vision. So that would mean it wouldn't be the sole source of funding for public software or public digital infrastructure. There would be other sources of funding for any project from other governments, foundations, and small donors. So the consequences of that, we think, would be advantageous relative to, for example, a pure government model. One advantage is it would provide a stable source of funding because of the ties to government, and empirically, the CPB has been a stable source of funding for now over 50 years. That's different from saying it would be a source of stable funding, meaning that it would continue to fund the same people and organizations, which might or might not be desirable. It would provide a separation between the control over design and content on one hand and funding on the other, which is what we see in the CPB case. CPB, it does produce a few programs, but for the most part, its funding supports others to create content. And that would be the case here too. It allows for multiple sources of funding so that projects would not be dependent on just one, but the imprimatur of the Corporation for Public Software, we think, would serve as a coordinating focal signal that might help to overcome the kind of over pluralism and lack of coordination, the lack of focus and silos that we see when you get to have multiple nonprofits and foundations all pushing their own projects. So anyway, that's a bit about the proposal and some of the rationale for it. And I'm happy now to take questions.
Thank you, Todd, for really giving us this, big picture overview and really dissection of the current state of the industry and how it's hampering deliberation. I'm going to get started with the question. Since I'm in this position, I'm going to use this. So actually, I want to go back to some of the earlier research that you mentioned that you did in the early 2000s and in East Palo Alto, because I think it's both a time that's so interesting and a place too that's so relevant. And, it sounded from what you were describing, assessing both what worked and what didn't, that, I felt that the place of communities that are impacted by technologies was far from being, central to the design of the technology, right? It's designed for communities, but it's not necessarily involving communities within the design. And so when you get to this point in your presentation that, the current state of the current social media platforms are not designed with democratic intent, it sounds to me like this is one of the big issues, and we're seeing a lot of advocacy around this at the moment, bringing communities within the design of the platform. So I wonder how you see this idea of bringing communities within the conceptualization of the design, this being sort of a core democratic thing at stake here. How do you see that being, this challenge being met by your proposal?
So can you say again what the challenge is exactly?
Yeah, so the challenge is to bring communities within the actual design, the process of designing the technologies, right?
Yeah.
And bringing people that are not technologists, people that are impacted by technology at the center of that process, or at least, being a component of that process.
Right. So I think that the term for that I'm most familiar with is participatory design. And I'm a big fan of that. That could have been one of the bullet points there. I think that there's another talk to be given, or another set of principles to be talked about here that would involve the criteria for funding. And I think that participatory design, democratic design, would be a factor that should at least favor a project for funding, if not be a requirement. So, and participation can take various forms, but I think our current thinking about it is that we want to be flexible and open-minded about what the best approaches will be, but I would certainly want to make a lot of room for the participation of users and the public in design and governance of platforms that are funded this way.
So we have a question from Ludwig, and it's a pretty big one, so I'm going to read it. What could commercial social media giants change to be less harmful to democracy? To be more specific, if you had 51% of the voting power of Facebook shares for a few months, what would you change? Is there any hope? So I know the title of your paper is A New Hope, so I know you have hope, but yeah, I'll let you answer this.
Yeah, so there's certainly various views on that. There's a book by Siva Vaidyanathan called Antisocial Media, which tries to make the case that, at least in the case of Facebook, that the business model of Facebook is so intrinsically a problem that there's no way that Facebook really can reform itself to deal with the problems that it creates for democracy. At the same time, he doesn't, and we don't argue that it should go away as a platform. We just think that platforms like Facebook should be used more for the purposes for which they were intended, and there should be alternatives which are publicly funded or funded through some kind of model like we are advocating that provide a different kind of software. So an analogy is what happened with the creation of public broadcasting in the 1960s. There was a situation then that's kind of analogous to what we're seeing now, in which all of the television and radio media in the United States in the late 50s and early 60s were commercially based. And at a certain point, I think many people understood that there was something missing, something lacking in this for educational content in particular, content that was responsibly geared toward children, that was more public affairs. The share of news and serious public affairs on commercial broadcasting was diminishing. famously in the late 50s, leading Edward R. Murrow to denounce what had happened and leave CBS. And there were some scandals, the quiz show scandal and payola scandals that made people very skeptical about commercial media for democracy. And so we think that there's a similar situation now. And I think Ethan Zuckerman, I think recently at MIT and now moving to the University of Massachusetts, has a similar outlook, that the moment is ripe for, in the US in particular, for creating an alternative that's more under public control and in the public interest. So I'm not sure if that addresses what you asked or not.
I think it does. Ludwig, I think that's fine. We have a couple of questions that are by Margaret and Argiri. So the question from Margaret is, do you have ideas for what kind of organization, current or new, could actually run and facilitate the platform, especially in a country with low trust in government and few neutral, non-politicized organizations? In real life, a library or community center might host these deliberations. Are there online equivalents?
Yeah, so my favorite widely used online platform is Wikipedia. And I like the way that it's, wow, Zoom wants to update. This is not a good moment to do that. Let me see if I can. I think that the governance of Wikipedia and the fact that it is open source software with a robust user community that is very involved in constantly maintaining the content, that's the kind of model that I'd be looking for. And it's been very successful. It's one of the top internet sites, but really the only one that is a model of democratic governance and participation. And I think the fact that it worked in the domain of an encyclopedia is interesting, and that it hasn't really been possible for things like social media suggests to me that there's something about the economics of social media which needs to accommodate a very large number of users and their individual content, and where you don't want a relatively small number of editors deciding that something is not notable or interesting enough to many users to keep around. That type of platform requires a lot more resources, requires more server capacity. It requires much more support for a much broader community of end users to be able to edit it. And you know, Wikipedia just wouldn't cut it in that world. It's still quite difficult to edit. You have to have fairly formidable internet skills in order to be a good editor in Wikipedia. And you have to, so yeah, I mean, that's the type of organization I would look to, but I think it also points to the need for different funding models.
Actually, just a nice follow-up to this that comes from Argiri, which is like, she's wondering if you have non-American examples that come to mind. Other, you know, so Wikipedia is one model that we've discussed a lot in the class over the year. But do you have any other sort of examples that come to mind, especially from a non-US perspective?
Yeah, so in the paper, we talk about the software called Consul, C-O-N-S-U-L, which is used in Spain. And so we like that as an example of public interest democracy software. There are other projects which are more internationally based, so I don't know if they would qualify as non-US or not, but one that I like is the Lumio platform, which is used by lots of grassroots, kind of radically democratic groups in the US and elsewhere. So those are two. But I must say that even though I've been outside of the US for almost 6 months now, I do have a bias toward knowing about and caring about what's happening in the US. And others are less biased in that way, and I'd really encourage them to engage with us.
Great. I have a quick question about how do you see, you know, you're focused on software, but how do you see the other layers of technologies coming into play in that model? Is it something in your mind that, you know, the software aspect is the one that's the most crucially needed, and it might build towards, you know, corporations for public hardware or corporations for public infrastructure, digital infrastructure at a more, yeah, so I'd love to know a bit about this.
Yeah, I mean, our focus has been on software, but one could make a case for a focus on hardware as well. There's I mean, for example, municipal broadband has been an approach that many people have advocated as a way of breaking up internet service provider monopolies and cellular monopolies in the US. So that things like public fiber and publicly owned hardware infrastructure, I think, are interesting, as well as other approaches to allocating spectrum, using spectrum in smarter ways that doesn't depend on proprietary control of spectrum. It just hasn't been the focus of our work.
I think we've reached the time, unless there's a pressing question from anyone who wants to jump in now. I think we're gonna wrap it up here. Thank you so much, Todd, for joining us today and sharing your work. And we very much look forward to seeing how the ID travels, and you know, we'll do our best to make sure it picks up. Heather, do you want to add a few more technical information about the upload and everything?
No, so as usual, we will upload the recording of this to Canvas, and response discussion questions will be posted within 24 hours.
Great.
All right.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Toussaint and Heather.
Thank you so much.
Right on.
Thank you.
And everybody. Take care.